Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is episode 16 in the series 21st-Century Children. There is a lot of evidence showing that the most effective parents tend to be those who understand positive methods of promoting children's growth, and also know how to avoid negative conditions that might harm their progress. In this episode, Dr. Scoresby identifies what research suggests are the most common parental and family behaviors that harm children so you can avoid them.
In the series, 21st Century Children, I've raised the proposition that kids during this generation or period of time need more help than perhaps children of any other time. The reason for this is because there are a lot of conditions that exist in our society at large and in our neighborhoods and in our churches and institutions around us, which make it more difficult for a child to grow in a healthy, positive fashion. What I'm about to describe may have existed for a long time, but at my vantage point in looking out in society, it seems to me that it's more often that we'll run into an educator who has decided to do something different than what the community of parents hope will happen in education, or we might find an unscrupulous business person that has impact on our kids. And all of this is going on and other examples like it. At the same time, we have absolutely amazing examples of kindness and opportunities to give and to serve one another. And so it's a bit strange. So I've tried in this series to identify a lot of things that parents can use that would give you advantage with children of this century so that they get the extra help they need and they are able to progress satisfactorily and emerge as successful and mature, wholesome adults. In this episode, I am going to attempt to identify the most common things which you should avoid. These are family practices that harm and injure children or make it difficult for them to thrive. And my goal here is to not spend a lot of time on the negative, but to identify them so that you can be more aware of them and have a chance to say, well, I won't do that. Or if you do see that happening in your family, you'll know that you need to move fairly rapidly to make sure they're not repeated. So I've taken a look at the research that identifies these negative qualities and the impact on children. And they're in the literature that is called dysfunctional families. They're in literature which identifies the origin of mental and emotional disorders. And they're in the literature which describes from a sociological perspective about the decline of the modern family and its effect, the negative effect that has on children. I mention that because I want you to understand that what I'm going to describe has a fairly significant research basis. It's well known, for example, that family experiences affect the development of children. I say that, and it's obvious, I know, but I want to make the point that it's obvious that negative and positive experiences affect children. It has only been in the last few years, however, that researchers have systematically studied the family to determine how it influences the development of children in a highly specific way. Interestingly, that also led to research identifying the specific factors which should be avoided if parents want to rear healthy kids. In that process, we have learned some interesting things. One highly significant result of this research is that the actual effects of a family on children are determined by factors within the child as well as within the family environment. For example, some children with excellent family environments do not do well as they grow up and struggle in many different ways. Further, some children in difficult family circumstances live and perform well even though they do not have the advantages of other children. I'll give you an additional example. In the studies of violent behavior, researchers would present, say, a video showing acts of violence and watch how the children responded. And they discovered that some children turn away from it. It's if it repulses them and they don't want to have to look at it. But other children are enticed by it and they're intrigued by it and they want to pursue it. And so they learned that in order to understand the full effect of a family on a child, they had to also understand the effects of the qualities within the child and how it matched up or failed to match up with what conditions happen in family. Another very common example is what happens when parents adopt children and bring them into a family where the parents have their own set, their background and set of ideas and ideals. Quite often, children's biological makeup make it difficult for them to adjust to what the parents expect or hope for. So it's not uncommon, for example, for a family psychologist, when parents present certain forms of behavior, the psychologist will ask, is this child adopted? In order to explain the conflict that exists between parents' notions and what they hope will happen and what kind of conditions the child can manage. So one of the things we want to talk about in children is something called environmental sensitivity. Some families will explore the world and bring home interesting things to discuss and share. Others are less aware of their environment and might be frightened of it. Therefore, they are less likely to venture out and learn. And in addition, families can be understood in terms of the types of activities they participate in. Some may actively participate in religious activities, while others participate in non-religious social activities. So, what does that mean? Well, you would look at a family and take a look at its sensitivity to the environment. How much does it participate in the world around it? How much doesn't? Then do the same thing for a child. How sensitive is a child to the conditions that go on around, or how does he lack of sensitivity or awareness? So, for example, children quite often who have allergenic responses are highly sensitive to conditions in their environment, and so they are more vulnerable or are susceptible to what happens in their family. Now, another area that everyone is affected by is the leadership and relationship styles that parents present. People and families form relationship styles. These relationships are demonstrated in the way leadership is exerted in the family. Leadership may be democratic, where most family members have a say in the way the family is governed, or authoritarian, where one parent or both makes strict demands on children. In any event, all families will have a leadership and relationship style which characterizes the family. This may show up in communication styles like sarcasm or criticism or passivity or indifference or lack of involvement or high involvement. So if you're going to understand both the positive and negative factors which influence children, you'd want to take a look at the leadership and relationship styles presented by parents which exist in their home with the kids. Now, the next item I want to present is how dysfunctional families differ from, let's say, healthy or effective families. Again, let me just remind you that the word dysfunctional just means that the family has inside of it several conditions which prevent the positive or optimal growth of children. So if you learn about a family, you know that there are some always that will be positive and constructive, that some are not. So the term dysfunctional means the family is not able to promote the positive growth of its members, parents and children. Instead, family members are involved in practices that hurt their growth. Researchers have given names to certain conditions which prevent these positive growth experiences, and so we're going to identify them. But notice in advance that these conditions exist because the family members do not have a broad or clear understanding of children and the knowledge of how to promote growth and development in the first place. I'm going to repeat that. Most of the conditions which are factors occur because the parents or the other family members do not understand children and what it takes for children to grow and thrive. So here's the first factor you want to avoid. It is called enmeshment. This condition exists when children believe their thoughts must be the same as other family members. Enmeshment is created in several ways. Excessive fear or disapproval is a leading cause. In addition, when families fail to recognize individual traits, needs, desires, and emotions of individual family members, then it is possible for an individual to think he or she is simply like everyone else, or a small cog in a huge machine. In healthy families, there is strong emphasis on both togetherness and individuality. Individuals are asked to make choices where they are primarily responsible, and in addition, communication in the family allows for individual opinions. Here's the next one, very common. We all know about it. It's known as abuse. Abuse can be anything which removes a person's sense of self-control and self-confidence. In families where there are a lot of factors that prevent growth, there may be one or more types of abuse. This may be physical, where an older, bigger person physically hurts a younger, weaker person. Abuse may be emotional, where words are demeaning and hurtful, and where affection and attention is withdrawn or used to exploit someone. Now think about that for a minute. The withdrawal of love. So if a child doesn't do something that you want or does something you don't want, withdrawing your love and affection for a certain period of time is the same thing as abuse and is considered on the same scale as a significant form of emotional abuse. Abuse may be sexual, where one person is used and exploited for the gratification of another without having a chance to make choices or be aware of the consequences. In many instances, extreme levels of stress from outside pressures are related to the incidence of abuse. So in healthy families, relationships are established for the welfare of individuals. Therefore, how they act toward each other is moderate and non-exploitive. Methods of discipline are democratic, and there are open displays of affection which are not withdrawn as a result of misbehavior. Here's the next factor to avoid. It is known as excessive dependency. Children begin life dependent on adults. This dependency is recognized and accepted because children are not able to care for themselves. And as they mature, however, children typically want to do things for themselves and make demands to do so. The parent-child attachment is sufficiently intense that unless parents and children are sensitive to the creation of independence, children can learn excessive dependency. This is manifest by helplessness, inability to leave the home, passivity when there's proximity to parents, failure to achieve, irresponsibility, deviance from family rules, which appears to require parents to exert control, confusion and indecision, and separation distress when leaving parents. These conditions can be caused when parents do not encourage gradual separation between themselves and their children. Further, some parents assume excessive responsibility for their children and attempt to prevent failures by rescuing them from hurtful situations rather than letting children solve their own problems. Parents may also indulge their children without setting behavioral limits and enforcing them. So abuse and other kinds of abuse, for example, is when parents will give and give and give and give, and the child is not asked to do anything in return or to earn it, and so they become dependent on the child or the parents. When children are overindulged and have no standards to live up to, they may acquire the belief that they need only be nice and pleasant to be adequate. Dependency can be enduring. There is some evidence that dependent children become dependent adults. So, for example, an adolescent who becomes dependent on drugs or controlled substances often lives for years, even though they've stopped the drugs, as emotionally dependent on parents. Living in the basement room, parents are paying for the rent, you get the idea. This means that they will seek relationships with others which approximate the emotional conditions of their early family experience where they were dependent. They may, for example, seek a marital partner whom they can be dependent upon, and they will be uncomfortable when they're asked to act decisively and independently. Here's another factor which occurs in families, and it is something that parents contribute to or not contribute to, so you have to be selective about it. We know it generally as mental and emotional illness. Now, for many years, researchers did not make any connection between families where there are a lot of things we should avoid and emotional and mental problems. Now, however, there is a clear link between family dynamics such as chemical abuse and mental and emotional illness. 40% of chemically abusing teens have parents who abuse chemicals, such as alcohol and drugs. Some forms of depression appear to be inherited, but other forms of depression can be learned from parental examples. When families have communication which is not logical or based on reality, children can learn a form of irrationality which manifests itself in schizophrenic thought disorders. The family appears to believe something, and children assume that it is factual, but it is not. An example is the famous case of the Emmanuel David family, where the father kept his children isolated from any other source of information, proclaimed himself to be a prophet or the Holy Ghost, and then jumped from a hotel window, followed by 4 of his children and his wife. 2 children survived. In contrast, healthy families have a fairly open communication system with the world around them, but selective. They may screen out information which does not promote their specific values, but they are usually aware of and communicate with people and institutions outside the family. Now, here's something that you might laugh at or at least smile. The only name of it is a name which describes what happens, and it's called incompetence. Some parents do not have basic child care or even organizational skills. Therefore, they are not able to organize a family or care for children in ways which promote growth. In these cases, families do not have routines of care, such as bedtimes or meal times. They do not have methods which allow them to identify and respond to children's emotional needs in terms of clothing, feeding, emotional support, and so on. Children's physical and mental growth may be retarded. In addition, they may have very limited ability to function in social situations or achieve educationally or at work. Healthy families, of course, have effective child care methods and organize their families in ways which are conducive to healthy growth. That is, there are some routines, there are some projects they plan, there's also spontaneous time, but on the whole, families feel organized and at least like they are productive a good portion of the time. So they have positive care routines, set predictable activities for the family, and nurture child growth in a variety of ways. Now let's take a look at some family processes or dimensions that we should avoid. They're also dysfunctional because when they're not handled well, then they can harm the positive growth of kids. But all of these exist inside every family, and so we have some good, some bad, some better, some best. So the goal here is to learn about these and then learn what makes them the most successful. So for example, most of us think about families as parents and children living together. We think about the difference between families with 1 parent, 2 parents, 1 child, many children, or all boys or all girls. These descriptions do not help us identify the dimensions in families. There are other ways to distinguish families that are dysfunctional or unhealthy from those that are effective. We can do this by evaluating family communication, how they get their work done or work strategies, the affectional system, a rule system, and a lot of other things I mentioned earlier, such as environmental sensitivity and leadership styles. So let's examine communication and what makes it difficult. All families are networks of communication. That is, what happens to one person affects everybody else as well most of the time. So when we talk, speak, communicate, interact by acting, adjusting to, so on, everybody in the family is affected by their communication patterns. And families vary in how much information they communicate, whether they encourage everyone to participate, and what they communicate about. Families may also perpetuate communication problems when they interrupt each other, blame, criticize, speak sarcastically, or neglect communicating at all, or just decide we're not going to talk about these things because they cause problems. Most dysfunction in families occurs because family communication is twisted and perverted in order to communicate something that is not healthy, so things don't mean what they appear to mean, and we cannot understand each other's communication well. So in healthy families, though, we don't have the negative aspects I talked about, and the families tend to value communication highly, so they avoid doing anything will prevent it from taking place. So they use communication more than they control. They will use communication to solve problems, to build relationships, to create emotional intimacy, to achieve understanding, to pay attention, to do all those things that communication can serve an important purpose. But you need to remember that all forms of communication transmit meaning. And if the meaning is clear and simple and it's listened to and understood, then mentally children do better. When the communication is not, if it's twisted and perverse and fouled up in some way, a lot of blame attached to it, a lot of fear, a lot of defensiveness, boy, that's difficult then, and problems usually arrive with one or more children. Now let's take a look at performance or work or the achievement that is in a family. Everybody wants their children to be high performers at school or in athletics or just getting things done or being productive. Some of that is really good. The problem occurs when there's more emphasis on getting things done than there is on quality relationships. And so when parents emphasize and argue, make demands, insist that children accomplish some things, don't spend time with them, don't communicate, there's not affection and nurturing going on, then children often can be harmed by the exaggerated efforts to get them to perform well. Over the years, I've seen kids with emotional problems because academically they couldn't handle some subject which was necessary for what career their parents wanted them to select, or the parents wanted them to achieve highly, and some kids were not motivated, so the parents got exasperated, got angry, imposed conditions, and the kids just responded by not doing that. So together, the parents and the kids produced a lot of failure for the children. So how you go about getting work done, you could learn specific methods to help children learn to be independent and productive and value that. You might go, for example, to the website of firstanswers.com and see the programs having to do with awakening the brain's potential and the 12 most effective study strategies, and they'll give you positive ways to help children achieve, at least academically. Now, the rule system is the same. Some families have too many rules that are dysfunctional. Some have no rules when they need to, and some can't adjust. Once they get the rule system created, they can't make adjustments over the time. And it's also true that there are formal rules which are talked about and imposed, and then there are a bunch of traditional rules that are just sort of habits about the way we do things. So families have formal rules which are organized and discussed. They also have informal rules in the form of expected or routine practices. Some families will have many, many rules, as I mentioned, and others less. So, for example, a family might have curfew rules and no rules about meal times, or another would have rules about TV watching, game playing, internet watching, and so on. Most families have a discipline system where parents or caretakers express approval or disapproval for what children do. Now, why do we care about it? Well, we care because work without relationships is drudgery, but a high number of rules without relationships is tyranny. And it's this tyranny that quite often we see in families where kids resent it, rebel, become dysfunctional in terms of their obedience to parents, and produce a lot of conflict in the family. Now, in the conclusion of this episode, I want to remind you that I've mentioned a few, the most significant in my opinion, of the conditions in families to avoid if you wish to promote the healthy development of 21st century children. I still believe, that these children, this period of our lives and your lives as parents, need extra help in the way of healthy, positive parenting and family environment where we avoid a lot of the negatives which I've talked about, so children can have positive growth experiences that enable them to be very successful.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by firstanswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit firstanswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.